The blue light of the smartphone screen felt like a laser cutting through the darkness of my bedroom at 3 o'clock in the morning. I didn't mean to be awake, but at 73, sleep is a fickle friend that leaves you the moment your joints start to throb. I reached out with my right hand, the one with the crooked index finger and the thick, ropey scar running across the knuckles from when a steel beam crushed it 20 years ago, and fumbled for the device. My granddaughter Maya had set up this Instagram thing for me a few months back. She told me it was so I could feel connected, so I wouldn't feel so alone in this quiet, one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that the city forgot 10 years ago. I didn't have much to look at usually, just photos of garden landscapes or woodworking videos, but tonight, the algorithm decided to hand me a knife and watch me twist it into my own chest. The first photo that loaded was Julian, my son, my only child. He was standing in a ballroom that looked like it belonged in a palace, wearing a navy tuxedo that probably cost more than my first 3 cars combined. His hair, which I used to ruffle when he was a boy, was slicked back with expensive pomade. He looked like a stranger. He looked like a man who had never known the grit of a construction site or the smell of wet sawdust. I stared at his face, waiting for the image to make sense. Maybe it was a gala, maybe a charity event for the engineering firm where he worked, but then I swiped my thumb across the glass, and the world stopped spinning. There she was, Genevieve Harrison. I knew her name because I'd met her once, at a cold clinical coffee shop where she spent 45 minutes looking at me like I was a stain on a white rug. In the photo, she was draped in silk and lace, a waterfall of white fabric that pooled around her feet like mountain snow. She was holding a bouquet of rare orchids, and Julian was looking at her with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a decade. It was pure, unadulterated devotion. They were standing under an archway of white roses, and the caption underneath read, "The beginning of the Sterling Harrison legacy, the 24th of October, 2025. Yesterday, they got married yesterday. I sat up in bed, the old springs groaning under my weight. My heart wasn't racing, it was doing something worse. It was slowing down, turning heavy and cold, like a stone sinking into a dark pond. I swiped again. There were the in-laws. Silas Harrison, a man whose family name was plastered on half the libraries in the state, and his wife, Beatrice. They were beaming, holding champagne flutes that caught the golden light of the chandeliers. Silas had his arm around Julian's shoulder, pulling him in close, claiming him. The caption on that one was even worse. "Finally, the son we always wanted." I looked at my own hands in the dim light. These hands built the foundation of the house Julian grew up in. These hands worked double shifts at Sterling Foundations for 40 years, pulling shifts in the freezing rain and the suffocating heat of the Midwest summers, just so Julian could have the right sneakers, the right tutors, and the right university degree. I had literally broken my body to make sure he never had to lift anything heavier than a pen. And yet, in the most important moment of his life, I wasn't just absent, I was erased. I scrolled through 32 photos. I looked for myself in the background of the wide shots. I looked for my reflection in the silver platters or the windows of the ballroom. Nothing. I saw his college friends. I saw Genevieve's bridesmaids. I saw the governor of the state. I saw 80 people who had been deemed worthy of witnessing my son's union, and not one of them was the man who had taught him how to tie his shoes or how to be a man of his word. I felt a phantom pain in my knuckles, the old injury flaring up as if it remembered the weight of the steel. I realized then that I wasn't just a father he didn't invite. I was a secret he was keeping from his new, shiny life. I remember when Eleanor, my wife, was still with us. She died 5 years ago, her body eaten away by a cancer that was as aggressive as it was cruel. During those 18 months of hospital stays and home hospice, Julian was busy. That was his word. He was always on the verge of a promotion, always stuck in a late-night meeting, always flying to Chicago or New York for a pivotal deal. He'd show up for 20 minutes, smelling of expensive cologne and anxiety, check his watch 6 times, and leave before the nurse could even change Eleanor's IV. When she finally took her last breath, I was the one holding her hand. I was the one who felt her pulse vanish. Julian arrived 3 hours late, cried for exactly 10 minutes, and then started asking about the life insurance policy. I should have known then. I should have seen the cracks in the foundation. But a father's love is a blind, stupid thing. You tell yourself excuses because the alternative is too painful to face. You tell yourself he's just ambitious, that he's doing it for the family name, that he'll come around once the pressure fades. But looking at these photos, I realized the pressure hadn't faded. It had simply changed shape. He wasn't running toward success anymore. He was running away from me. I thought about the house in Oak Haven. It's a beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman on a quiet tree-lined street called Willow Lane. I bought it 10 years ago with the settlement money from my workplace injury and every cent of the savings Eleanor and I had scraped together over 40 years. I didn't buy it for myself. I bought it for Julian. I remember the day I handed him the keys. He was 28, struggling with rent in a cramped city apartment. I took him out to the driveway, pressed the cold metal into his palm and told him, "This is your home, son. As long as these walls stand, you'll never be adrift." He cried that day. He hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would snap. He promised me that he'd take care of the place, that he'd fill it with grandchildren, that I'd always have a seat at the head of the table during Sunday dinner. And for a while, he kept that promise. But then came the promotions. Then came the high society circles. And then came Genevieve. Slowly, the Sunday dinners stopped. The phone calls that used to last an hour dwindled down to 30-second check-ins. "Hey Dad, busy week, talk soon." Then it became texts. Then it became nothing. I hadn't seen the inside of that house in 2 years. Every time I offered to come over, there was an excuse. The kitchen was being remodeled. They had a termite scare. Genevieve's parents were staying over and there was no room. I sat in my small apartment, eating canned soup and watching the world move on without me, while my son lived in a house paid for by my blood and bone, acting like I was a ghost. I looked at the phone again. There was a comment on the wedding post from Silas Harrison. It said, "A perfect union of 2 great families. To the future of the Harrison-Sterling Empire." Something shifted inside me then. It wasn't the searing heat of anger. It was the cold, hard clarity of a man who has spent his life reading blueprints. I saw the structure of my life for what it was. I had built a skyscraper on sand. I had given everything to a man who viewed my sacrifice as a burden, an embarrassing footnote in his new biography. He wanted a perfect day. He wanted a life where I didn't exist. Fine. If I was a ghost, then it was time I started acting like one. Ghosts don't have to follow the rules of the living. They don't have to be patient, and they certainly don't have to be kind. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of my living room. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy manila envelope. I hadn't looked at the contents in years, but I knew exactly what was inside. When I bought the Oak Haven house, I intended to transfer the deed to Julian's name on his 30th birthday. But then Eleanor got sick, and the lawyers were expensive, and the paperwork got buried under a mountain of medical bills and grief. I had given him the keys. I had given him the life, but I had never actually signed the house over. Legally, officially, the Briarwood estate on Willow Lane, the place where my son was likely sleeping at this very moment with his new bride, still belonged to me. I looked at the clock. 3:45 a.m. I didn't feel tired anymore. I felt energized, a strange electric hum vibrating in my fingertips. Julian wanted a toast for his wedding. He wanted to celebrate his new legacy with the elite of Silveridge. Well, I was going to give him a wedding present he would never forget. I took a deep breath, the air in the apartment tasting like dust and regret. I picked up the phone one last time and looked at the photo of Julian and Silas. They looked so comfortable, so secure. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to vanish. I put the phone face down on the desk and reached for my address book. I needed to find a specific number. A man I had worked with years ago who had gone into high-end real estate. A man who knew how to move properties fast, quietly, and without sentiment. I didn't know it yet, but the silence of my apartment was about to be replaced by the sound of a wrecking ball. Julian had spent years trying to bury me. He just forgot that I'm the one who taught him how to dig. The sun hadn't even begun to peek over the horizon when I started making the calls. My contact, a man named Marcus Vane, was a shark in the Silveridge real estate world. We'd met when I was still a foreman. I'd saved his skin on a project that was sinking into a swamp, literally. He owed me a life debt, and I was about to collect. When Marcus answered, his voice was thick with sleep, but it sharpened the second I told him what I wanted. "Thomas, it's 4 a.m. You want to sell the Willow Lane property? Now? Julian's living there, isn't he?" "He is," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "But he's not the owner, Marcus. I am. And I want it gone. Cash buyer. Fast close. I don't care if I lose 20% on the market value. I want the papers ready by the time the courthouse opens." There was a long pause on the other end. Marcus knew the history. He knew about Eleanor. He knew about the years of double shifts. "This is about the wedding, isn't it?" he asked softly. I saw the photos, Thomas. I wondered where you were. I was exactly where I am now, I replied. In the dark. Now, help me find some light. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in a glass-walled office downtown, the scent of expensive espresso and cold air conditioning filling my lungs. Marcus had moved mountains. He had a buyer, an investment group looking for prime rental real estate in Oak Haven. They didn't want a tour. They didn't want a home inspection. They wanted the zip code and the deed. As I watched the ink from my pen soak into the signature line of the sales agreement, a memory flickered in the back of my mind. It was Julian's 10th birthday. I had worked 36 hours straight to afford the mountain of presents under the tree, but I was so exhausted I fell asleep during his cake. I woke up to him, shaking my shoulder, his small face filled with worry. "Dad, are you okay?" he'd asked. I'd grabbed his hand and told him, "Everything I do for you, Julian." I felt a phantom ache in my chest as the notary stamped the final page. I wasn't just selling a house. I was selling the last piece of my heart that still believed in him. The money was wired into my account by noon, a sum so large it felt surreal, like a high score in a game I didn't want to play. I stood on the sidewalk outside the office, the bustling city noise swirling around me. For 40 years, I had defined myself by what I could provide. Now I was a man with a bank account full of silver and a soul full of lead. I waited until I was back in my armchair before I turned my phone back on. It exploded. Vibrations rattled against my thigh for 3 minutes straight. Missed calls, voicemails, texts. Most of them were from Julian, but there were a few from Genevieve. I didn't answer. I didn't read them. Not yet. I wanted him to feel the silence. I wanted him to wonder why the man he had successfully erased was suddenly the only person who could save his world. Around 4 p.m., I finally opened the messages. "Dad, why are there people on the lawn?" "Dad, some guy just knocked on the door saying he's the new owner's representative. What is this?" "Answer your phone, goddammit. Genevieve is hysterical. Her parents are coming over for dinner." I leaned back, a cold smile touching my lips. I could picture the scene. Julian, in his designer casual wear, standing on the porch of the house he thought was his birthright, being confronted by a man in a cheap suit with a legal eviction notice. I could see Genevieve in the background, her old money poise shattering like cheap glass. My thumb hovered over his name. I dialed. He picked up on the first half ring. "Thomas! What the hell is going on?" he screamed. There was no dad. No "how are you?" Just the raw, jagged edge of panicked entitlement. "There's a moving truck at the curb, and some man named Miller says he's taking possession of the property in 48 hours. He says you sold it. Tell me this is a mistake." "It's no mistake, Julian," I said. My voice was a low growl, the sound of a foundation settling. I checked the records. I realized the house was still in my name. And since I'm a complication in your life, I figured I should simplify things. I don't want to be a burden to your new family, so I sold the asset. I'm moving to a retirement community. I need the liquidity. You sold my house?" He sounded like he was choking. "Genevieve's father, Silas. He spent $50,000 on the new landscaping. We just finished the nursery for the baby." The world went silent. "The nursery, the baby, I whispered. "We were going to tell you," Julian stammered, his voice suddenly small. "After the honeymoon. We wanted it to be a surprise." "A surprise," I repeated. The word tasted like ash. "Like the wedding was a surprise? Like the fact that your in-laws are the parents you always wanted was a surprise? You weren't going to tell me, Julian. You were going to wait until the child was born, and then you were going to send me a photo on Instagram so I could see what else I wasn't invited to." "Dad, please, don't call me that," I snapped. "A father is someone you honor. A father is someone who belongs at the head of the table, not tucked away in a dark apartment like a shameful secret. You wanted a perfect life, Julian. You wanted the Sterling Harrison legacy. Well, legacy is built on foundations, and I just pulled yours out from under you. Where are we supposed to go?" Julian was sobbing now. It was a pathetic, wet sound. "Genevieve's parents. They'll never forgive me. Silas will pull his investment from my firm. You're destroying my life." "No, Julian," I said, standing up and walking to the window to watch the sunset. "I'm just teaching you the first rule of construction. Never build on property you don't own. You have 48 hours to get your things out. The new owners are turning it into a rental for college students. I suggest you call a locksmith, or better yet, call Silas. He seems like the kind of father who has plenty of room for you." I hung up. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of being forgotten, it was the silence of a job finished. But as I sat there, looking at the empty walls of my apartment, a new thought crept in. This was just the beginning. Julian wouldn't go quietly. Silas Harrison wouldn't allow his daughter to be humiliated without a fight. I didn't know it yet, but the complication Julian feared was about to become his worst nightmare. I had the money, I had the deeds, and for the first time in 73 years, I had nothing left to lose. I sat down and began to write a letter, not to Julian, but to Silas Harrison. If they wanted to play the game of legacies and reputations, I was going to show them exactly how much dirt I had gathered on those construction sites over the years. I knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking, and I knew exactly which of Silas's charity buildings were held together by nothing but bribes and substandard concrete. The night air in my apartment was thick, heavy with the ghosts of 40 years of silence. I sat at my small walnut desk, the one Eleanor and I bought at a garage sale when we were first married. Back then, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, but we had a plan. We had a vision. We thought we were building a family that could withstand any storm. Looking back now, I realize I was the only one stacking the bricks. Julian was just the one living in the shade I provided. I began to write, my hands steady despite the ache in my joints. The letter wasn't for Julian, it was for Silas Harrison. Silas was a man who lived in a world of high-gloss finishes and marble floors. But I knew the man he used to be. Decades ago, before he was the titan of Silverage, he was a mid-level contractor with a habit of cutting corners that could kill a man. I was the foreman on his biggest project back in '98, the Kensington Plaza. I remembered the day the inspectors came by, and I remembered the way Silas's face went pale when he saw the structural cracks in the support columns. He didn't fix them. He didn't reinforce the steel. He handed a thick envelope to the lead inspector behind a dumpster, and the cracks were magically resolved on paper. I had kept that secret for 25 years, not because I was a criminal, but because back then, a man like Silas could bury a worker like me in legal fees or worse. I had a wife and a young son to protect. But now I had a son who thought I was a complication and a wife who was already in the ground. The threat of Silas Harrison didn't feel like a mountain anymore. It felt like a pile of loose gravel. As I wrote, I couldn't help but think about the first time Julian brought Genevieve to meet me. It was 3 years ago, a Sunday afternoon that should have been a celebration. I'd spent all morning in my tiny kitchen, making Eleanor's famous slow-roasted brisket. I'd polished the silver, ironed the tablecloth, and even bought a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. I wanted to show this girl, this daughter of privilege, that my son came from a home of dignity and warmth. They arrived 40 minutes late. Genevieve walked into my apartment as if she were entering a museum of ancient, dusty failures. She didn't sit down, she hovered. Julian looked at her for cues on how to behave in his own father's home. When I served the brisket, Silas's daughter poked at it with her fork as if it were a biological hazard. "It's very hearty, Mr. Duval," she'd said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that felt like acid. Julian didn't look at me. He looked at his shoes. "Dad, Jen is used to a more refined palate. We actually have reservations at the Gilded Oak in an hour. We just stopped by to say hi." They left before I could even clear the plates. I sat there in the silence, the smell of the brisket I'd worked on for 6 hours filling the room, and I realized for the first time that my son was embarrassed by me. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because my existence reminded him of the unrefined world he was trying to leave behind. I spent the rest of that night throwing the food in the trash and washing dishes until my hands were raw. That was the first open loop in our relationship, the first time I realized that my son was no longer mine. He was being sculpted into a Harrison. I finished the letter to Silas. It was short, it was professional. It simply reminded him of the Kensington Plaza and suggested that if he wanted to maintain his legacy, he might want to reconsider how his family treated the complications of the world. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for Julian to be forgiven. I just wanted Silas to know that the old man he was looking down on was the only person who held the blueprints to his ruin. I didn't know it yet, but that letter was going to act like a spark in a room full of gasoline. The next morning, the silence of my apartment was shattered not by a phone call, but by a visitor. I expected Julian to come back, begging or screaming, but instead, there was a quiet, authoritative knock at 7 a.m. When I opened the door, it wasn't my son. It was a man in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a leather briefcase. He looked like he was made of stone and expensive cologne. "Mr. Duval? My name is Elias Thorne. I represent Silas Harrison," he said, his voice as smooth as polished glass. "May I come in?" I didn't move. I stood in the doorway, my scarred hands gripping the frame. I don't recall inviting Mr. Harrison into my home, and I certainly didn't invite his shadow. Thorne didn't blink. "Mr. Harrison received your correspondence. He's a busy man, but he's also a man who values family. He's concerned that this misunderstanding with your son is spiraling out of control. He's prepared to offer you a settlement, a significant one, enough for you to move into the best luxury retirement community in the state, provided you rescind the sale of the Willow Lane property and sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your previous employment." I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my throat. They were trying to buy my silence again. They thought my dignity had a price tag. "Tell Silas that the Willow Lane property belongs to a very nice investment group now. The papers are filed. The money is in my bank. And as for my silence, it's not for sale. It's a gift I'm choosing not to give anymore." Thorne's eyes sharpened. "Mr. Duval, you're an old man living in a crumbling apartment. You're making an enemy of a man who owns the skyline of this city. Don't let your pride destroy the little you have left." "I have exactly what I need," I said, stepping back to close the door. "I have the truth, and unlike Silas, I don't have to hide behind a lawyer to tell it." I slammed the door and locked it. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline of a man who had finally stopped being the victim of his own kindness. I walked back to my desk and looked at a small wooden box I hadn't opened since Eleanor's funeral. Inside were her letters, her journals, and a small, leather-bound book where she kept track of everything. Eleanor was the smart one. She was the one who saw through people before they even spoke. I opened the journal to the year Julian started dating Genevieve. I hadn't read these entries before. I hadn't been able to bear the weight of her words. But now, I needed her strength. The entry from the 12th of August, 2022, caught my eye. "Julian came by today. He thinks I don't notice the way he looks at our furniture, the way he winces when Thomas talks about the job site. He's falling for that girl, but he's really falling for the idea of being someone else. I'm afraid, Thomas. I'm afraid he's going to trade his soul for a seat at a table where he'll always be a guest. If I'm not here, don't let him do it. Even if it hurts him, don't let him forget where he came from." I sat there, the journal trembling in my hands. Eleanor had seen it coming. She knew the Harrisons wouldn't just take our son, they would erase us. And she had given me my orders. I wasn't just doing this for my dignity anymore. I was doing it for her. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Julian tried to call again, but I blocked his number. Genevieve sent a long, rambling email about family values and the stress on the baby, which I deleted without reading. They were trying to use the child as a shield, a weapon to make me feel like the villain. But a man who hides his own father from his wedding doesn't get to lecture anyone on family values. Just as the sun was starting to set, I heard another sound at the door, not a knock this time. It was the sound of a key turning in the lock. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't changed the lock since I moved in. Julian had a spare. The door swung open, and Julian stepped in. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Silas Harrison himself. Silas looked exactly as he did in the photos, tanned, expensive, and utterly convinced of his own power. He looked around my apartment with a sneer that he didn't even bother to hide. "So, this is where the complication lies," he said, his voice echoing in the small space. Julian looked caught between two worlds. He looked at me, then at Silas, his loyalties fraying like an old rope. "Dad, please, Silas wants to talk. We can fix this. You don't have to do this." I stood up, pulling myself to my full height, ignoring the protest of my lower back. I looked Silas Harrison right in his cold blue eyes. "You're in the wrong house, Silas. This isn't one of your boardrooms, and I'm not one of your subcontractors." Silas took a step forward, his presence filling the room. "You think that little letter scares me, Thomas? You think some 20-year-old structural cracks matter to a man like me? I can bury you before the sun goes down tomorrow, but I'm a generous man. I'm here because my daughter is upset, and my son-in-law is acting like a coward. I'll give you one last chance to walk away with your pockets full." I looked at Julian. "Is that what I am to you now? An investment to be managed? A problem Silas has to fix for you?" Julian's face went red. "You sold my house, Dad. You put my pregnant wife on the street. What did you expect? I expected you to be a man, I said. I expected you to remember who paid for that house. I expected you to have the guts to stand up for your father instead of hiding him like a dirty secret. Silas laughed, a dry, hollow sound. He did what any smart man would do, Thomas. He traded up. He saw a better life, and he took it. You're just a reminder of the dirt he came from. That was the moment. That was the moment the last thread snapped. I walked over to the wooden box on my desk, pulled out a small, yellowed photograph, and held it up. It wasn't a photo of the Kensington Plaza. It was a photo of Silas and me, 25 years ago, standing in front of a half-collapsed wall on a site he'd tried to hide. And in the corner of the photo, clearly visible, was the body of a worker who hadn't made it out, a man whose death Silas had paid to have recorded as a heart attack rather than a sight failure. Silas's face didn't go pale this time. It went gray. I didn't just keep the blueprints, Silas, I whispered. I kept the proof. And I didn't send it in the letter because I wanted to see the look on your face when you realized that the dirt Julian came from is the only thing that can bury you. Julian looked from the photo to Silas, horror dawning on his face. What is that? Silas, what is he talking about? The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in. Silas Harrison, the man who owned half the skyline, was staring at that photograph as if it were a ghost rising from a shallow grave. His polished veneer didn't just crack, it disintegrated. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the frantic searching for a way to spin this, to buy it, to bury it. But for the first time in his life, his money was just paper. Julian, wait in the hall, Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low octave. It wasn't a request. No, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a saw through pine. Julian stays. He wanted a legacy. He wanted to be part of your family so badly he erased his own. He deserves to see exactly what kind of refined bloodline he's joining. Julian looked between us, his face pale, his breath coming in shallow hitches. Dad, what is this? What does he mean about a worker? I didn't take my eyes off Silas. His name was Miguel. He was 22. Julian. He had a wife and a baby on the way, just like you. Silas sent him into a trench that wasn't shored up because he was behind schedule on the Sterling Heights project. The earth collapsed. Silas didn't call the authorities first. He called a fixer. By the time the ambulance arrived, the scene had been cleaned, and Miguel's family was told he had a pre-existing heart condition. They got a small payout and a closed casket. That's enough, Silas roared, stepping toward me. He looked like he wanted to wrap his hands around my throat, but he stopped when I didn't flinch. I had spent 40 years on job sites with men far more dangerous than a billionaire in a silk suit. Is it? I asked. Because I have the logbooks, Silas. The real ones. The ones that show you were warned 3 times about that trench. I have the signed statements from the other 2 men on that crew, men you thought had moved away or died, but men I've kept in touch with. Men whose medical bills I helped pay for with the overtime you thought I was spending on beer. Julian's knees seemed to give out. He slumped against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the man he had chosen as his new father. Is it true? He whispered. Silas? Silas didn't answer him. He didn't even look at him. To Silas, Julian was just a chess piece that had suddenly become a liability. He turned back to me, his face a mask of cold fury. What do you want, Thomas? You want the house back? You want the money? Name the price. Everyone has one. That's your mistake, Silas, I said, feeling a strange, hollow sense of triumph. You think everyone is like you. I don't want your money. I already sold the house. I have more money in the bank than I'll ever spend in the years I have left. I don't want power. I just want the truth to have its day. If you release that, you destroy Julian too, Silas hissed, leaning in close. He's a partner in the firm now. His name is on the masthead. The Sterling Harrison legacy falls. He falls with it. Is that what you want? To ruin your own son's life out of spite. I looked at Julian, my son, the boy I'd taught to be honest, to be hardworking, to be a man of integrity. Somewhere along the way, he'd traded those lessons for a navy tuxedo and a seat at a table of wolves. Julian, I said softly, you have a choice to make, right now. You can walk out that door with him and try to keep the lie alive. You can spend the rest of your life wondering when the other shoe is going to drop, wondering if your child will one day find out that their grandfather was a murderer and their father was a coward who helped hide it. Or you can do the right thing. And what is the right thing? Julian asked, his voice cracking. Losing everything? My job? My house? Jen's respect? She's pregnant, Dad. Where are we supposed to go? You go to work, I said. A real job. You live in a place you can actually afford, not a palace bought with blood money. You become the man your mother thought you were. Silas let out a jagged, mocking laugh. He doesn't have it in him, Thomas. I saw it the minute he met Genevieve. He's soft. He wants the easy path. He'd rather be a wealthy secret keeper than a righteous pauper. Isn't that right, Julian? Julian looked at Silas, then back at me. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the pull of the life he'd craved against the weight of the man he'd been raised to be. For a second, I thought he might actually choose me. I thought the foundation might hold. I can't, Julian whispered, his eyes filling with tears. I can't lose Jen. I can't let my baby grow up with nothing. Silas, please, talk to him. Make him stop. The disappointment that washed over me wasn't sharp. It was a dull, crushing weight. It was the final confirmation. My son wasn't a victim of the Harrisons. He was one of them. He had chosen the easy lie over the hard truth. There it is, Silas said, straightening his tie, his confidence returning like a rising tide. He's made his choice. Now, Thomas, let's talk about that photograph and how much it's going to cost me to watch you burn it. I'm not burning anything, I said, walking over to the window. Below, on the street, a black sedan was waiting, but behind it, another car had pulled up, a white van with a local news logo on the side. And I'm not talking to you anymore. Silas's eyes went wide as he saw the van. What did you do? I didn't call the police, Silas. Not yet, I said, turning back to him. I called a journalist I know, a woman who specializes in old money scandals. She's been digging into your firm for years, but she lacked the primary source. I told her I'd be ready to give her an exclusive interview at 8 p.m. tonight. That gives you exactly 30 minutes to get out of my house. You're insane, Silas spat, his face turning a purplish hue. I will tie you up in court until you die. I will sue you for defamation, for extortion. Go ahead, I said. But the photo is already in a digital cloud. 3 different lawyers have the access codes. If anything happens to me, or if the interview is blocked, the whole file goes to the district attorney and the New York Times simultaneously. This isn't a negotiation, Silas. It's a demolition. Julian was staring at me as if I were a monster. How could you do this? To me? To your own family? I'm doing this for my family, Julian, I said, my heart breaking with every word. I'm doing this for Eleanor, and I'm doing this for your child, so they don't have to grow up in a house built on a graveyard. Silas grabbed Julian's arm, his grip tight and commanding. Come on, we're leaving. We have teams for this. We'll crush him before the morning edition hits the stands. They walked out, Silas marching with the fury of a wounded king, and Julian trailing behind him like a ghost. The door closed, and the silence that followed was absolute. I stood in the center of my small living room, the photograph still in my hand. I didn't know it yet, but Silas was right about one thing: he did have teams, and the next 24 hours wouldn't be a legal battle. They would be a fight for my very survival. Julian had spent years trying to push me out of his life, but now his new family was going to try to erase me from existence. I checked the clock, 7:40 p.m. The reporter would be knocking soon. But as I looked at the shadow of a man standing across the street, I realized Silas wasn't waiting for the morning edition. He was ending this tonight. The knock at the door wasn't the aggressive, foundation-shaking pounding Julian had delivered earlier. It was light, rhythmic 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was the signal the reporter, Sarah Jenkins, had agreed upon over the phone. I took a deep breath, clutching the manila envelope to my chest like a shield. My heart was a jackhammer against my ribs, but my mind was clear. I had spent 40 years building things that were meant to last. Tonight, I was going to tear something down that never should have been built in the first place. I opened the door, and a woman in her late 30s stepped in. She was sharp, dressed in a trench coat that had seen better days, with eyes that looked like they had memorized every dark corner of Silveridge. "Mr. Duval?" she asked, already stepping into the entryway. "The van is out front. My cameraman is doing a perimeter check. We don't have much time. Silas Harrison's people are like white blood cells. The moment there's an infection in the legacy, they swarm to kill it. I'm the infection," I said, gesturing to the small kitchen table, "and I've been gestating for 25 years. We sat down, and for the next hour, I poured it all out. I told her about the mud, the smell of the wet earth, the day the trench collapsed, and the way Silas had looked at the body of that boy, Miguel, with nothing but annoyance, as if the kid had died just to spite his construction schedule. I showed her the logbooks. I showed her the photos. I told her about Julian, too, not the engineering partner he was now, but the son who used to play with wooden blocks on my floor. The son who had been bought and paid for by the very man who had covered up a murder. Sarah was scribbling furiously, her recorder blinking a steady red rhythm. "This is more than a scandal, Thomas," she whispered. "This is a criminal indictment. If we run this, the Harrison name doesn't just tarnish, it evaporates. But you have to know, they will come for you. They won't just sue you, they'll try to erase you." "I've already been erased, Sarah," I said, looking around my empty, quiet apartment. "My son did that for them at the wedding. You can't kill a man who's already a ghost." I didn't know it yet, but I was wrong. You can always lose more. You can always find a deeper level of rock bottom. Just as Sarah was packing up her equipment, my phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number, but something told me to answer. I put it on speaker. "Dad?" It was Julian. But he wasn't screaming anymore. He sounded small, broken. "Dad, please. You have to stop. I'm at the hospital. Genevieve. The stress. The news about the house. The argument with Silas. She's in early labor. The doctors are worried about the baby. If you do this tonight, if you put this on the news, you're not just killing Silas. You're killing your grandchild's future. You're killing the only family I have left." I looked at Sarah. She had stopped moving. She knew who was on the line. "Julian?" I said, my voice thick with a sudden, agonizing doubt. "Is she okay?" "No, she's not okay," he sobbed. "She's terrified. Silas is downstairs with the lawyers, but I'm up here alone. Please, Dad, for the love of God, for the memory of Mom. Give me 24 hours, just 24 hours to make sure my child is safe. Don't do this to me. Don't let my baby be born into a war zone." I felt the resolve I'd spent all day building start to crumble. I looked at the photograph of Miguel. I thought about his baby, the one who never got to meet his father. Then I thought about Julian's baby, my grandchild, a life that hadn't even begun yet, already being used as a pawn in a game of high-stakes blackmail. "I have to go," I told Sarah, my hands shaking. "I can't do the interview tonight, not while a child is in the balance." Sarah looked at me with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Thomas, you know this is what they do. They find your soft spot and they hammer it. This is a tactic. And if it isn't," I snapped, "if that baby dies because I was too busy being righteous, then I'm no better than Silas. Go. I'll call you tomorrow." She left, her disappointment trailing behind her like a shadow. I stood in the center of the room, feeling the silence return, heavier than before. I grabbed my coat. I had to go to the hospital. I had to see for myself. I had to know if Julian was lying to me one last time, or if I had truly pushed things too far. The hospital was a cathedral of white light and the smell of antiseptic. I found the maternity ward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw Julian through the glass of a waiting room. He was slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. He looked aged, his expensive suit wrinkled, the Harrison polish completely gone. When he saw me, he didn't move. He just looked at me with eyes that were hollowed out by fear. "Is she?" I started. "She's stable for now," Julian whispered. "They gave her something to stop the contractions, but the doctor said she needs absolute peace, no stress, no complications." He spat the word out like it was a curse. I sat down 3 chairs away from him. We didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the vending machine and the distant paging of doctors over the intercom. "I didn't want it to be like this, Julian," I finally said. "Then why did you do it?" he asked, not looking at me. "Why couldn't you just let us have our life?" "So you weren't at the wedding. Big deal. Most people hate their parents anyway. You could have just stayed in your apartment, taken the checks I was going to start sending you, and been a grandfather from a distance. Why did you have to blow it all up?" "Because the checks wouldn't have been from you, Julian," I said. "They would have been from Silas, and I don't want his blood money. And as for being a grandfather from a distance, is that what you wanted for your kid? A grandfather who was a secret? A man you were ashamed to introduce?" Julian finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't regret. It was a cold, simmering resentment. "You think you're so noble, Thomas. But look at you. You're alone. You're bitter. And now, you've ensured that your grandchild will never know your name. Because even if Genevieve and the baby come through this, I am never letting you near them. You're not a father. You're a wrecking ball." I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him about Miguel, to tell him about the house, but then the elevator doors opened. Silas Harrison stepped out, flanked by two men who looked like they were carved out of granite. He didn't look like a man whose legacy was in danger. He looked like a man who had already won. He walked straight to Julian and put a hand on his shoulder. Then he looked at me. "The doctors say she's doing much better, Julian. Why don't you go in and see her? I need a word with Mr. Duval." Julian stood up without a word to me and walked toward the maternity suites. He didn't look back. Silas waited until the door clicked shut before he turned his full attention to me. He leaned in, the scent of his expensive cigar lingering on his breath. "Nice touch with the reporter, Thomas. Truly, for a minute there, you almost had me worried. But you see, the thing about being a complication is that you're predictable. You still have that blue-collar morality. You still care about things like innocent lives and family." My blood went cold. "What are you talking about, Silas?" "Genevieve isn't in labor," Silas whispered, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "She's at her parents' estate, having a quiet dinner." Julian knew, of course. He's a very good actor when his lifestyle is on the line. "We just needed you away from that apartment for 2 hours. 2 hours is a long time for a faulty gas line to develop a leak, don't you think?" I lunged for him, but the two men behind him caught me instantly, pinning my arms back with a strength that made my bones creak. "Your apartment, the logbooks, the photos, the proof you were so proud of." Silas shrugged, checking his gold watch. "It's all ash by now, Thomas. The fire department will call it an accidental kitchen fire. An old man. A forgotten stove. It's a sad story, really. Almost as sad as the fact that you're now homeless and penniless because I took the liberty of having my legal team freeze the funds from your house sale under an emergency injunction for fraud." I struggled against the guards, but it was useless. Silas stepped closer, his voice a silk ribbon around my neck. "You thought you were the one doing the demolition? No, Thomas. I built this city. I know exactly how to tear down a structure that's no longer useful. You have nothing. No son, no home, no evidence, and no one who will believe a word you say." He signaled the guards, and they shoved me toward the elevators. I fell against the metal doors, gasping for air, the world spinning in a blur of white light and hospital floors. "Get out of my sight," Silas said, turning his back on me. "And if I ever see you near my family again, I won't use a gas leak. I'll use a shovel." I stumbled into the elevator, the doors closing on Silas's triumphant silhouette. I hit the button for the lobby, my mind racing. My apartment was gone. My proof was gone. My son had lured me into a trap with the lie of a dying grandchild. I was 73 years old, and I was standing in a hospital lobby with nothing but the clothes on my back and the crooked, scarred hands that had built my own ruin. But Silas made one mistake. He assumed that because I was a builder, I only knew how to use the tools he could see. He forgot that a foreman doesn't just keep logs in a drawer. As I walked out into the cold night air, smelling the distant scent of smoke on the wind, I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive that I had palmed the second I saw the reporter walk into my apartment. I hadn't given Sarah Jenkins the real files. I hadn't kept the originals in my desk. I had been a foreman for 40 years. I knew that before you pour the concrete, you always make a backup of the blueprints. I looked up at the night sky, my eyes stinging with tears of rage and grief. Julian was gone. The son I loved was dead to me, but Silas Harrison, he thought he had burned the evidence. He didn't realize he had just given me the one thing I was missing, a reason to stop being a builder and start being a ghost. I stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital, the cold air biting through my thin jacket, and for the first time in my life, I felt the true weight of my years. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock me. I looked at my hands, the hands that had built homes for hundreds of families, the hands that had cradled Julian when he was a feverish toddler, and I realized they were empty. No home, no money, no son. Silas Harrison had been thorough. He had stripped me down to the studs, leaving nothing but the raw, aching frame of a man. I didn't take a taxi. I couldn't. My cards were frozen, and the few $20 bills in my pocket had to last. I walked. I walked for 2 miles, the scent of charcoal and wet ash growing stronger with every block. When I finally reached my street, the flashing red and blue lights of the fire trucks were already dimming. The yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off the charred remains of the only place I had left that felt like Eleanor. I stood there, a ghost among the gawkers, watching the firemen coil their hoses. The roof of my apartment had collapsed. Everything, the walnut desk, Eleanor's journals, the small wooden box of photos, the very smell of her perfume that lingered in the curtains, it was all gone. It wasn't just a building. It was my memory bank. Silas hadn't just tried to kill my future, he had incinerated my past. I saw Julian's car parked a block away. He was standing by the driver's side door, his face illuminated by the amber glow of a street lamp. He looked at the wreckage, then his eyes drifted toward me. For a second, I saw a flicker of the boy I used to know, a flash of horror, maybe even regret, but then he saw Silas's black sedan pull up behind him. Julian stiffened, wiped his face, and climbed into his car without a word. He didn't come to check if I was alive. He didn't offer a coat. He just drove away, following the man who had bought his soul. "I didn't think you'd actually show up to watch the embers," a voice said from the shadows. I turned to see Garrett Vane, the younger brother of Marcus, the realtor. Garrett was a man who lived in the cracks of the city, a private investigator who specialized in the kind of dirt that doesn't wash off. I'd helped him out years ago when a contractor tried to bury him in a literal sense on a botched demolition site. "I have nowhere else to go, Garrett," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. He looked at the blackened building, then back at me. I heard the scanner. Accidental gas leak. Convenient, isn't it? Especially since Silas Harrison's name popped up on a city planning memo for this block just last week. He wants to turn this whole strip into a luxury mall. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of the thumb drive. "He thinks he burned the blueprints, Garrett. He thinks he's won." "Come on," Garrett said, tilting his head toward his beat-up truck. "You can't stay here. The police will start asking questions, and Silas's pet detectives will be looking for a body that didn't burn. My office is off the grid. We'll start there." We drove in silence through the neon-lit veins of the city. I stared out the window, watching the luxury condos and high-rise offices glide by, all of them monuments to men like Silas. Men who built their empires on the bent backs of people like me. I thought about the baby lie. Julian had used the most sacred thing in the world, the promise of a new life, to lure his own father into a trap. That was the moment the last of my mercy died. You can rebuild a house. You can recover lost money. But you can never, ever fix a heart that has been used as bait. Garrett's office was a cramped, windowless room above a neon repair shop in the industrial district. It smelled of ozone and stale coffee, but to me, it felt like a fortress. He pointed to a desk with a computer that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrap heap but hummed with surprising power. "Let's see what the complication brought to the party," Garrett said. I plugged in the thumb drive. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of folders I'd spent 20 years meticulously organizing. There were the scanned logbooks from the Sterling Heights project. There were the photos of the collapsed trench. But as I opened the third folder, the one I hadn't even shown the reporter, Garrett whistled. "Thomas, do you know what this is?" "It's the payroll," I said. "No," Garrett pointed to a column of numbers. "This isn't just payroll. These are shell company transfers. Look at the dates. These payments were made during the construction of the City Hall Annex and the new police precinct. Silas wasn't just cutting corners on safety. He was laundering money for the Sterling-Harrison merger through city contracts. And look at the signatures." I leaned in. My eyes weren't what they used to be, but I recognized the handwriting. It wasn't just Silas's signature. There, right next to the fraudulent totals, was a more recent set of initials. J.D. Julian Duval. The room went cold. I felt a nausea so deep it threatened to pull the floor out from under me. My son wasn't just a silent partner in Silas's family. He was the architect of the current fraud. He hadn't just been busy with meetings. He had been the one signing off on the substandard materials and the cooked books. He wasn't a victim of Silas's influence. He was the protege. "I didn't know," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I thought he was just embarrassed. I didn't think he was a criminal." "He's an engineer, Thomas," Garrett said, his voice unusually gentle. "He knew exactly what happens when you use low-grade concrete in a load-bearing wall. He knew, and he signed anyway because Silas promised him the world." I sat back, the weight of the betrayal finally breaking me. I had worked 40 years to give him a life of dignity, and he had used that life to build a house of cards. He hadn't just erased me from his wedding. He had used the skills I taught him to poison the city I helped build. What happened next changed everything. "We can't just give this to a reporter," I said, my voice hardening. "Silas has the press in his pocket. He'll bury the story, claim the files are forgeries, and have us arrested for corporate espionage before the ink is dry. No, if we're going to take down a skyscraper, we don't start at the top. We start at the foundation." "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked. "The Harrison-Sterling merger happens in 3 days. I said, remembering the headlines. It's a billion-dollar deal. All the investors, the banks, the city officials, they'll all be at the Harrison estate for the gala. Silas wants to showcase his legacy. He wants to show the world that his family is the future of Silveridge. I looked at the crooked index finger on my right hand. I spent my life making sure things were level, making sure things were square, making sure the weight was distributed properly. Silas and Julian, they've put all their weight on a single point, their reputation. If we take that away at the exact moment the deal is being signed, the whole structure collapses. They won't just lose their money, they'll lose the one thing they value more, their name. It's risky, Thomas. They'll have security, they'll have Julian. Good, I said. I want Julian to see it. I want him to see the moment the easier way becomes the end of his world. For the next 48 hours, we didn't sleep. Garrett used his contacts to track the digital trail of the money laundering, while I did something I hadn't done in years. I reached out to the old guard, the retired foreman, the inspectors Silas thought he'd bought, the workers who had been pushed out when the Harrison way became the only way. I met them in diners and bowling alleys. I showed them the photos of Miguel. I told them about the fire, and one by one, they stepped up. They didn't want money. They wanted justice for the years they'd been forced to stay silent. They had their own souvenirs, emails, voice recordings, samples of the crumbly concrete Silas had used in the new stadium. The plan was a masterpiece of structural sabotage. We weren't going to call the police. We were going to wait until the cameras were rolling and the champagne was flowing. On the night of the gala, I stood in front of a mirror in Garrett's office. He had found me a tuxedo, not a designer one like Julian's, but a classic, sturdy black suit that fit my broad shoulders. I looked at the man in the mirror. He didn't look like a victim. He didn't look like a complication. He looked like a man who was about to deliver a final inspection. You ready? Garrett asked, checking his watch. The press is already there. Silas is giving his speech in 20 minutes. Wait, I said. I picked up a small silver locket I'd pulled from the ashes of my apartment. It was the only thing that had survived a miracle in the debris. Inside was a picture of Eleanor. I tucked it into my breast pocket over my heart. Now I'm ready. As we drove toward the Harrison estate, I saw the glow of the party from miles away. It sat on the hill like a crown of light, arrogant and bright. I thought about the house on Willow Lane, now filled with college students who didn't know the history of the walls. I thought about the fire that had consumed my life. And I thought about Julian, standing on that stage, thinking he had finally reached the top. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was already in motion. Silas Harrison hadn't just been lying to me, he had been lying to Julian too. And the secret he was keeping from his new son was the one thing that would ensure that when the building fell, no one, not even Julian, would walk away. We pulled up to the service entrance. The guard looked at my face, then at the clipboard Garrett was holding. Maintenance and sound tech, Garrett said with a wink. The gates opened. We were in. The Harrison estate was a fortress of glass, limestone, and arrogance, perched atop the highest hill in the county like a predator watching its territory. As Garrett and I moved through the service corridors, the air changed from the cold, industrial scent of the van to a cloying mixture of expensive lilies and high-end catering. My tuxedo felt like a suit of armor, though my hands, the hands that had mixed the very concrete this estate was likely built upon, felt heavy and out of place among the silver trays and crystal flutes. The AV booth is behind the main ballroom, Garrett whispered, checking a blueprint on his tablet. He'd hacked the estate's security grid 10 minutes ago, but we were ghosting through the blind spots. Silas is doing the big reveal in 10 minutes. If we're not in position by then, the deal closes, the money moves offshore, and we're just two guys with a thumb drive and a grudge. We slipped past a line of servers, their faces masks of professional indifference. I kept my head down, the brim of a borrowed service cap shading my eyes. I didn't want to be recognized yet. I wanted the shock to be total. We reached a heavy oak door marked staff only and stepped into a small, darkened room overlooking the ballroom. Below us, the elite of the city were gathered in a sea of black ties and silk gowns. I saw Julian. He was standing near the stage, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand, laughing at something Silas Harrison was saying. Julian looked perfect. He looked like the man he'd always wanted to be, unburdened, wealthy, and accepted. But as I watched him, I saw the way he adjusted his cuff repeatedly, a nervous tic he'd had since he was 6 years old. He wasn't comfortable. He was performing. And right next to him was Genevieve, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes scanning the room like a general inspecting a conquered territory. There was no sign of a medical emergency. She looked radiant, her pregnancy barely showing under a custom-made Empire waist gown. The lie of the hospital visit flared in my chest like a hot coal. They had used a child's life to steal my dignity. I gripped the railing of the AV booth so hard the wood groaned. "Thomas, look at this," Garrett hissed, pointing to a second monitor he'd tapped into. He had accessed the internal server for the Sterling-Harrison merger. "I just pulled the Schedule B documents. Silas isn't merging with Julian's firm to grow. He's doing a burn-down liquidation." "What does that mean?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the screen. "It means Silas is transferring all the liabilities from his old, crumbling projects, the ones with the bad concrete and the lawsuits, into Julian's name. He's making Julian the sole officer of the subsidiary that holds all the criminal risk. Once the ink is dry on this merger, Silas walks away with the cash, and Julian stays behind to take the fall for the City Hall fraud and the Kensington Plaza cover-up. Silas didn't just buy a son-in-law, Thomas. He bought a fall guy." I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the height of the booth. I realized then that Silas hadn't just stolen my son. He had prepared him for the slaughter. Julian thought he was entering the inner circle, but he was actually being led into a cage. He was the insurance policy for a billionaire who didn't want to go to prison. I looked back down at the ballroom. Silas was stepping up to the microphone, the crowd falling into a respectful, expectant silence. He looked like a king about to bestow a blessing. "My friends, colleagues, and partners," Silas began, his voice booming with that practiced, effortless authority. "Tonight is about more than business. It's about legacy. It's about the future of Silveridge. When I looked for a partner to carry the Harrison name into the next century, I didn't look for a corporation. I looked for a man of character. I looked for Julian Duval." The crowd erupted in applause. Julian beamed, standing a little taller, his chest swelling with the poison of Silas's praise. He had no idea that in 5 minutes, his name would be the only one on the indictment papers. "Julian has brought a fresh perspective to Sterling Foundations," Silas continued, his hand resting on Julian's shoulder. "A dedication to structural integrity that reminds me of my own early days. Together, we are building a city that will stand for 1,000 years. "I can't let him do it," I whispered. "I have to stop the signing. If you just run down there, security will tackle you before you hit the stage," Garrett said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "But if we use their own tech, I've got the legacy video queued up on their projector. Silas thinks it's a montage of his greatest hits. I'm about to give it a remix." "Wait," I said, my hand on Garrett's arm. "I want to speak. I want them to hear it from me." "There's a wireless mic in the rack to your left," Garrett said, not looking up. "Channel 4. I'll patch you into the house speakers. But once you start, there's no going back. Silas will come for you with everything he has." "He already has," I said. I picked up the microphone. It felt heavy, like a hammer. Below us, Silas was gesturing to a large mahogany table on the stage. A legal assistant was laying out the final documents. The pen, a gold-plated fountain pen that probably cost more than my apartment's rent, was placed in Silas's hand. "And now," Silas said, his voice dripping with triumph, "to the future. The future is built on a foundation of lies, Silas." My voice boomed through the ballroom. The sound was deafening. The music cut out instantly. Every head in the room snapped upward, searching for the source of the voice. Silas froze, the pen inches from the paper. Julian's face went from a smile to a mask of sheer, bone-deep terror. He recognized the voice. He knew the ghost had returned. "Who is that?" Silas demanded, his eyes darting around the room. "Security, find the source of that feedback." "I'm not feedback, Silas," I said, stepping out from the shadows of the AV booth and onto the small balcony that overlooked the ballroom. I took off the service cap and tossed it over the railing. It drifted down like a falling leaf, landing on the mahogany table. The room went deathly quiet. I saw Genevieve's face pale. I saw the investors whispering. But most of all, I saw Julian. He looked like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. "My name is Thomas Duval," I said, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "I spent 40 years building the bones of this city. And tonight I'm here to give the final inspection." "Thomas, you're trespassing," Silas hissed, trying to regain his composure. He signaled to the security guards moving in from the wings. "You're an old, confused man who just lost his home in a tragic accident. Someone get him down from there before he hurts himself." The only thing that's tragic in this room is the paperwork on that table, I said. Garrett, roll the footage. The giant 4K screen behind Silas flickered. It didn't show the high-gloss images of glass towers. It showed the scanned payroll logs. It showed the shell company transfers. And then, it showed the video, the one I'd taken with my old flip phone years ago, the one Silas thought was long gone. It was a grainy, shaky clip of Silas Harrison standing over the collapsed trench at Sterling Heights, screaming at a foreman to bury the site and the body before the union reps show up. The gasp that went through the ballroom was like a physical wave. Silas turned around, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he saw his younger self on the screen, presiding over a crime scene. "That's a forgery," Silas screamed, his voice cracking. "A deepfake. This man is an extortionist." "Then explain the bank records, Silas," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Explain why you're transferring $50 million in liabilities to my son's name tonight. Explain to Julian why he's the only person whose signature is on the fraudulent city contracts for the new precinct." Julian turned to Silas, the pen shaking in his hand. "What?" "Silas, what is he talking about? You said I was a partner. You said this was our legacy." "Shut up, Julian," Silas snapped, the mask finally slipping. He looked at the investors, his eyes wild. "It's a hit piece, a disgruntled worker trying to sabotage a billion-dollar deal." "I'm not a disgruntled worker, Silas," I said, leaning over the railing. "I'm the man who taught that boy how to be an engineer. And I won't let you use the skills I gave him to rot this city from the inside out." I saw the lead security guard reaching the door of the AV booth. I knew my time was almost up. "Julian," I yelled, my voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't hide. "Look at the documents! Look at Schedule B!" "He's not giving you a kingdom, son. He's giving you a prison sentence. He lied about the baby, he lied about the house, and he's lying to you right now." Julian lunged for the papers on the table, flipping through the pages with a frantic desperation. Silas tried to grab them back, and for a second, the two partners were scuffling like common street thugs over a pile of paper. Julian stopped on the last page, his eyes widening as he read the indemnification clauses. "You bastard," Julian whispered, his voice carrying through the silent room. "You were going to let me go to jail for the Kensington Plaza." "It's business, Julian," Silas spat, his face twisted in a sneer of pure contempt. "You wanted the life. This is the price. You should have stayed in the dirt with your father." That was the moment the room exploded. The investors started shouting. The press began snapping photos like a barrage of gunfire, and the security guards finally burst into the AV booth. I felt a rough hand grab my shoulder, pulling me back from the railing. "Thomas, we have to go." "Now," Garrett yelled, grabbing his laptop. I looked back one last time. Julian was standing in the center of the stage, the documents scattered at his feet like autumn leaves. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, he didn't look at me with shame. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who had finally realized he'd been building his own gallows. The guards dragged me toward the service exit, but I didn't care. The tape was running. The evidence was live. The Harrison legacy was being torn down in front of a live audience. But as we reached the alleyway and the cool night air hit my face, I heard the sound of sirens, lots of them. And they weren't just police cars. I saw the black SUVs of the Federal Bureau of Investigation pulling into the estate's driveway. I realized then that the trap I'd set had worked better than I'd hoped. But as Garrett pulled the van away from the curb, I saw one more thing in the rearview mirror. Julian wasn't being arrested. He was walking toward a car with Genevieve, but she wasn't looking at him with love. She was looking at him with a cold, sharp calculation that told me the real war had only just begun. Silas was falling, but the Harrisons always had a backup plan. And I didn't know it yet, but my son was about to make a final, desperate move that would force me to choose between his life and my own. The dust didn't just settle after the gala, it choked the very air of Silveridge. For 3 days, the local news was a non-stop loop of the Harrison fall. Silas was let out in handcuffs, his expensive silk tie askew, his face a mask of humiliated fury that no amount of money could fix. The FBI didn't just look at the Kensington Plaza, they tore into every contract Silas had touched for 3 decades. The Harrison legacy was being dismantled brick by brick, and I was the one who had pulled the first stone. I was staying at a small nondescript motel on the edge of town, paid for with the cash I'd kept in my pocket. My cards were still frozen, but I didn't care. I had a bed, a roof that didn't belong to a billionaire, and a silence that finally felt like peace, but I knew the story wasn't over. A structure doesn't just vanish when you blow the foundation. The debris has to land somewhere. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after I had stood on that balcony and watched the world burn, when the knock came. It wasn't the rhythmic tap of Garrett or the heavy thud of a detective. It was the scratching, desperate sound of someone who had nowhere else to turn. I opened the door, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the man standing there. Julian looked like he had been living in the very trenches I'd described. His designer suit was stained and wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot and sunken, and he smelled of cheap whiskey and defeat. The Silveridge prince was gone. In his place was a broken man who looked every bit the 73 years I felt. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. I didn't invite him in. I just stood in the doorway, my scarred hands resting on the frame. "You have 30 seconds, Julian, and if you mention Silas or the firm, I'm closing the door." "She left me," he said, the words tumbling out with a sob. "Genevieve. The second the FBI froze the Harrison accounts, she vanished. She's in the Caymans with her mother. Her lawyers served me with divorce papers this morning, and the baby." He trailed off, his face twisting in a fresh wave of agony. "What about the baby, Julian?" I asked, my heart remaining a cold, steady stone in my chest. "There was no baby," he choked out, leaning against the doorframe for support. She lied to me, Dad. From the start, Silas told her to tell me she was pregnant to make sure I'd sign those Schedule B documents. He knew I'd do anything to protect my family. They used me. They used the idea of your grandchild to make me a criminal. The revelation should have hurt. It should have sent a shock wave of grief through me. But instead, I just felt a profound, hollow sense of pity. Silas hadn't just corrupted Julian, he had understood him perfectly. He knew that Julian's greatest weakness wasn't greed, it was the desperate, pathetic need to belong to something greater than a construction site. "I have nothing," Julian continued, sliding down the doorframe until he was sitting on the concrete walkway of the motel. "The Fed seized the house on Willow Lane. They say it's part of a civil forfeiture for the City Hall fraud. I have $100,000 in legal fees and a grand jury subpoena waiting for me tomorrow. They're going to send me to prison, Dad. Silas is going to pin it all on me." I looked down at him. This was the man who had erased me from his wedding. This was the man who had lured me into a trap while my home was being torched. "I need the money," Julian whispered, looking up at me with a spark of that old, entitled desperation. "The $500,000 from the house sale. If I have that, I can hire a real defense team. I can fight this. I can tell them I was coerced. Please, Dad, you said everything you did was for me. Prove it. Save me one last time." I leaned back against the wall, looking out at the flickering neon sign of the motel. "The money is gone, Julian," I said quietly. He froze. "What? What do you mean it's gone? You deposited it. You said it was in your account." "I did," I replied, "but I didn't keep it. The day after I sold the house, before Silas could freeze my accounts, I made 3 transfers. I sent $200,000 to Miguel's widow, the man Silas killed in that trench. She's putting her son through medical school now. I sent another $200,000 to a trust fund for the workers who were disabled on Harrison sites over the last 20 years. Men who didn't have a complication like me to fight for them." Julian's jaw dropped. That's $400,000. What about the rest?" "Where's the last $100,000? I used it to pay for a private investigation into Silas's offshore holdings," I said, a small grim smile touching my lips. "Garrett Vane doesn't work for free, Julian. That legacy video at the gala? That cost me the last of my savings. I didn't just sell your house to hurt you. I sold it to buy the truth. I traded the walls around your head for the light over your crimes." Julian stared at me, his face pale and horrified. You spent my inheritance to destroy me?" "No, Julian," I said, stepping back into the room. "I spent my life's work to save my soul. You were never getting that money. You had a house, a name, and a father who loved you. You threw all 3 in the trash for a tuxedo and a lie. You want to be a Harrison? Well, this is how it ends for Harrisons. You die in the dark, wondering who's going to pay for your funeral." "I'm your son," he screamed, standing up and grabbing the door. "You can't do this. I'm all you have left. You stopped being my son the moment you stood on that porch and watched my cake hit the floor," I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning. "You stopped being my son when you closed the door in my face at your wedding. And you died to me the second you lied about a child to protect a murderer." I reached out and gently removed his hand from the door. His skin felt clammy, like a fish. "I'm going to prison, Dad," he sobbed. "Is that what you want? To see me behind bars?" I want you to learn what it feels like to build something yourself, I said. Even if it's just a reputation for honesty in a cell block. Maybe in 10 years, when you get out, you'll look at your hands and see the dirt. Maybe then, you'll understand what it means to be a Duval. I closed the door. I heard him screaming outside for another 10 minutes. I heard him kicking the metal frame, calling me a monster, a traitor, an old man who had lost his mind. But I didn't open it. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the silver locket Eleanor had left behind. I opened it and looked at her smile, the one that had kept me standing through 40 years of back-breaking labor. I did it, Elle, I whispered. I finished the job. The next morning, I checked out of the motel. I had nothing but a small duffel bag and a bus ticket to a small town up north where Marcus Vane had a cabin I could use for as long as I needed. I walked to the bus station, my knees aching, my breath visible in the morning mist. As the bus pulled out of Silveridge, I saw the construction cranes on the horizon. They were still, their long necks frozen against the gray sky. The Harrison projects were halted, the sites crawling with investigators instead of workers. I looked at the city I had helped build, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a part of it. I felt like a traveler who had finally reached the end of a very long, very dusty road. A year later, I was sitting on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over a lake that was as still as a mirror. I had a small garden, a few chickens, and a stack of books I finally had the time to read. My hands still hurt, and my back still complained, but the weight in my chest was gone. I received a letter once a month from the prison. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. I knew what they said: apologies, excuses, pleas for a visit. But a foundation that has been completely pulverized can't be patched. It has to be cleared away so something new can grow. I looked at the scars on my knuckles. They were fading now, the edges softening with time. I realized then that my son had been right about one thing: I was a complication. But a complication is just something that makes a simple, easy lie impossible to maintain. I was the friction that stopped the machine. I was the crack that brought down the tower. People often ask me if I regret it. They ask if a house and a son aren't worth more than a moral victory. I just look at them and smile. Because they don't understand the secret that every builder knows deep in his bones. It doesn't matter how high the building goes. It doesn't matter how expensive the glass is or how many people admire the view from the top. If the man who built it can't sleep at night because he knows the foundation is rotten, then the whole thing is just a fancy way to die. I stood up, the old wood of the porch creaking under my feet. I walked inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down to watch the stars come out. I was an old man in a small cabin, and I had absolutely nothing to my name. And for the first time in 73 years, I was exactly where I belonged.